Welcome, everybody, to the Center for Strategic and International Studies. We have a very special program today. We're going to be talking about maritime disputes in Asia. This is an event that's co-sponsored by the CSIS Asia Maritime Transparency Initiative in our Southeast Asia program here at CSIS. And it's made possible with support from NHK, which will broadcast our discussion later today on the program NHK World. We have four excellent experts to discuss the maritime disputes in Asia with us today, representing not only their own individual perspectives, but also explaining the policies of the four different countries from which they come. I'm going to introduce them briefly. I should say, Bonnie Glaser, Senior Advisor for Asia and Director of the China Power Project at CSIS. And I'm going to start in my extreme left. Mr. Brian Andrews is a principal with the Asia Group. And prior to joining the Asia Group, he worked at the US Department of State. He was detailed to the National Security Council and was also country director for China in the Office of the Secretary of Defense. And then to his right, we have retired Vice Admiral Yoji Koda, who is a former Commander-in-Chief of the Self-Defense Fleet at Yokosuka and served during his career in many distinguished positions in the Japan Maritime Self-Defense Force. And then we have Elena Noor, who is Director of the Foreign Policy and Security Studies program at the Institute for Strategic and International Studies, Malaysia. She's also had positions at the Brookings Institution and at the Center for Non-Proliferation Studies in the Monterey Institute of International Studies in Washington, D.C. And then finally, to my left is Dr. Julia Schreier, who is currently a visiting fellow at Chatham House. She's an Academy Senior Fellow in their International Law Program. And her permanent position, which she will be returning to, is at Shanghai Jiao Tong University, where she is a professor of law. So we're going to start our discussion today talking about maritime disputes in East China Sea and South China Sea. I'd like to start from the really big picture. I think I'll start with you, Brian. Can you talk to us about U.S. interests in the maritime disputes in the waters of Asia, with a focus in South China Sea and East China Sea? Why is it that the United States has interest in these disputes?
Sure. No, thank you, and thank you for this opportunity. I think hopefully one of the positive outcomes of the ruling yesterday is greater attention to these maritime issues in the region, which do have a substantial potential to threaten kind of peace and stability in the region. So the fact that we're having focus here, I saw you on PBS last night, which I think is great, and obviously CSIS had a great event last night. So hopefully we'll see a sustained focus, because these are incredibly important issues, and I think national security policymakers as well as the general public should kind of be paying greater attention to them. I would just start by saying, while I served in U.S. government, I no longer serve in U.S. government in any way. I'm speaking purely on my own behalf and kind of my own views on U.S. policy. Taking a step back, I'd say you've got to think about the disputes in the context of the U.S. Strategic pivot or rebalance to the Asia-Pacific region under President Obama, where you saw a concerted effort on kind of multiple endeavors. One, enhancing our treaty alliances in the region. Two, building stronger partnerships with countries in the region, including particularly Vietnam, Singapore, Malaysia, Indonesia. Three, truly more enhanced engagement with China and trying to find cooperative areas for working together, where there have been substantial breakthroughs despite at times tensions, including on climate change, Iran, North Korea. Three or four, I would say, is the U.S. much deeper commitment in multilateral institutions, particularly the ASEAN-based multilateral architecture in the region. Additionally, you have substantial U.S. economic interests, a concerted look at the U.S. defense footprint and how to take greatest advantage of it in the region. And finally, advancing human rights, freedom, rule of law. And as you think across kind of all these U.S. interests in the region, the maritime disputes really kind of impact each of them. So when you're thinking about what are the U.S. interests specifically in the maritime disputes, I think we have to acknowledge that each is unique and has their own circumstances, whether you're talking about South China Sea, East China Sea, Yellow Sea. But there are a few threads of commonality which I'd like to briefly touch on. One is obviously the U.S. is not a direct party to any of the disputes. We are not a claimant. We do not have a direct interest in ultimately how they are resolved. And we do not take a view on the ultimate sovereignty of the underlying disputes at play. I do think we have several abiding interests. One is our commitment to our U.S. treaty allies, which is substantial, and obviously a number of our allies are involved in these disputes, whether you're talking Philippines in the South China Sea, or Japan in East China Sea, or Korea and other disputes, as well as kind of emerging partners are directly involved, Vietnam, Indonesia, Malaysia. So inherently that brings kind of the U.S. interest to the fore. We have the desire for the maintenance of peace and stability in the region, as well as unimpeded commerce and lawful commerce in the region, given the just massive driver it is for the global economy. And then freedom of navigation is priority not only for the commercial access as well as the U.S. military access. In terms of our interests, just a few others I would outline very briefly to tee off is seeing the parties involved address these issues diplomatically and peacefully. So I think there are some misconceptions that the U.S. views the region at times in kind of a zero-sum game, that if the U.S. is up, then China is down or another country is down. And I think there's inherent interest in U.S. policymakers to see basically these parties do more to talk with each other and address these disputes in kind of a positive and diplomatic means. We've seen a lot of progress on Japan and South Korea recently, which I think the Comfort Women Agreement really provided the space for a lot more kind of political dialogue as well as defense cooperation. We're seeing very good cooperation Philippines and Vietnam right now. I think the U.S. desire is to see all the countries in the region talking more diplomatically and improving their ties with China while they're getting closer relationships with the United States. Finally, I think U.S. interest and priority is seeing the avoidance of kind of unilateral or escalatory actions. So we don't want to see a disruption to the status quo, particularly in a kind of military sense, in a coercive sense. So a desire for more collaborative approaches and solutions to managing these disputes and hopefully finding a resolution, but not seeing essentially a militarization, which unfortunately we are seeing to some aspect in the South China Sea at the moment.
That's a great segue to a question I'd like to ask you, Admiral Koda. So the United States has these deep, enduring, and growing interests in the Asia-Pacific region and in these maritime spaces. And of course, that has been a driver for the U.S. rebalance to Asia. So could you tell us something about how Japan and you look at the rebalance to Asia?
Okay, thank you, Bonnie. I think Brian covered most of my parts, so I think no. So I think I don't have to speak a lot. But one thing important is, say, today's main subject is the maritime dispute in Asia. And if I take a look at this specific subject through the lens of the alliance or U.S. policy, of course, the U.S. rebalancing is the major player or important factor to think about that. So I think it's important to see the Asian maritime dispute through the lens of the U.S. rebalancing at the position of the U.S., the most closest alliance partner, Japan. And as Brian mentioned, the Obama administration has done a lot to realize his policy toward the Asia. And one of them is the rebalancing. And there are, I think, 2 or 3 sub-elements in the rebalancing. One is the political or diplomatic arena. For example, enhancing the Japan-US alliance, or the re-establishing the closer tie with the Filipinos by EDCA, the enhanced defense cooperative agreement, or the closer tie with Vietnam, or the new relationship with India. So those are kind of the comprehensive, the political and the diplomatic approach. And that has been pretty successful from the Japanese point of view. And then next subject or element is the military. The U.S. replaced the carrier composite at Yokosuka, the new carrier Reagan, improved version of the old George Washington, and bringing 2 new Aegis cruisers to Yokosuka, or bringing the littoral combat ship to the Singapore, or deploying the P-8 from the Singapore, or bringing the new nuclear submarines in Guam. U.S. military has been taking a lot of actions to realize the rebalancing from the military aspect. And the third element is the real operations. And this is also not the new subject to the United States. U.S. has been conducting a lot of the bilateral or multilateral military exercises with the ASEAN nations. But at least last several years after the rebalancing was announced, I think U.S. military has been taking a lot more active actions in this area. But key question is, as I mentioned, strategically or politically and diplomatic arena, I think the rebalancing has been successful. But in military arena, especially when we focus on the dealing the Chinese new adventurism in the South China Sea, for example, is U.S. rebalancing really successful or not? If I take the very short-term view, for example, stopping the Chinese, the artificial island making, that is not successful. And just yesterday, the ruling of the tribunal, the arbitral tribunal was announced. But that is not enough, I think, to stop the Chinese action in that area. So key question is how to maintain or how to regain the stability in the South China Sea by the new elements of the rebalancing. What I mean is, if my assessment, U.S. rebalancing is not so successful in the short term or tactically, U.S. and Japan, U.S. supported by Japan, have to develop a new strategy and tactics to regain the stability in the region. That is the new arena for us to do. So this is my question raising, but I'll stop here. Thank you.
Great. Well, since you've raised China, I think we'll bring Julia into the conversation here. And before we talk about specific things like artificial island building, I hope you can explain what China's larger maritime interests are. In the 17th Party Congress, Hu Jintao raised for the first time that China had the ambition to be a maritime power. And there's this discussion that's very widely held in many places in the government and in research institutions in China about maritime rights and interests. So why has this become more important to China in recent years?
Thank you, Bonnie. And very important questions to start with. I think for China, I think we can see this is really a continental kind of state for many, many years. And started from 1970s when China embarked the open door policy, and then we see the economic development. And then with more international trade, particularly the seaborne trade, going into the ocean. And then I think that started from for the state leader to think about the ocean, or to use the ocean, and also because of the economic development, and China has the capacity, and to develop the ocean resources and things like that. Actually, really started from 1970s, and China started to go to the ocean to use more deeper. I think along that line, you see the kind of maritime policy development in that area. And then I think started also from that, if you look at international background, the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea started to negotiate since 1973 and until 1982. Along that line, I think raised really the ocean awareness for China and even for the public. But it didn't really get much, touch to the national policy. Only, I think, started from the 1970s when we have more and more maritime dispute with the neighboring countries. and those things coming up to the national maybe political agenda. And I think really we see the landscape or seascape change in the East Asian seas. I think probably back to 6-7 years, 2009, maybe when we had a few of the nearby maritime neighbors, including China, start to implement more of maritime policies and laws and to safeguard its national interest, marine interest, rights and interests and things like that. We see more. I think that's also at the background setting we mentioned about the rebalancing policy from the states and change quite a lot of the lining up of regional states. And that's, I think, really the one aspect. But for China itself, I think still, this is a country just recently developed, we call it rising power or re-emergence of China. And economic development is still very, very strong kind of incentive. And now we can see China use the One Belt, One Road, and also about the Asian Infrastructure Development Bank, things like that, and really trying to share the benefit of the economic development. I think along that lines, and China really trying to how to say, to safeguard its national marine interest, right and interest, and also probably pursue more of economic development. I think that's very kind of clear direction for China. But obviously, since I think since the recent years, China start to set a goal to develop a national maritime power kind of states rather than the coastal states as previous and more defensive thing. But I really don't see much policy changes right now. China hasn't got really a maritime strategy at the moment. We do have the scholars propose for maritime strategy to set up or propose a comprehensive kind of policy directions. But I haven't seen that happen. Maybe it's a year to happen, but I think that's the situation now. And when we talk about maritime issue, we certainly can't really avoid the ruling yesterday came out by the arbitration tribunal set up the Annex 7 on the UNCLOS. I mentioned the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. But I think from the overall kind of national political agenda, it never reached so high at now. But I think probably afterward it will come down a bit. This is currently the situation. Probably also it's very important event for us to talk about the East Asian kind of maritime situation, and then probably find for a solution or better opportunities to resolve the issue.
All right, let's drill down a little bit on the South China Sea, Alina. If you could help us bring in ASEAN. What are ASEAN's interests in this? This has been a very divisive issue in ASEAN. So what is ASEAN's role, and how do you think about how ASEAN's going to play in the South China Sea territorial disputes going forward?
Right. Well, I think there's an important distinction to be made, right? So there's ASEAN as the institution and the organization of a collective grouping of 10 countries, and then there are the ASEAN member states. And not all of the 10 ASEAN member states have an equal stake in what's going on in the South China Sea. Collectively, as a grouping, all the ASEAN member states have either a direct or indirect stake in the South China Sea, because geographically, there's no way of getting around it. All 10 ASEAN member states are there, and the sea is there, and there's no way of avoiding the issue. Apart from that, I think if you look at mainland Southeast Asia, if you look at countries like Cambodia, Laos, Myanmar, they probably have less of an interest in the dispute in the South China Sea. And I think that's come through quite clearly in recent times, which is only natural. But for the maritime countries, even for the non-claimants, they do have an interest in what takes place in the South China Sea, because it's, as we all know, it's an important trading route, important shipping route. But there are also resources that many of the claimant states are eyeing, including fisheries and energy. For a country like Malaysia, where I come from, our economy relies on about 40% of energy revenues, and that's quite a bit. And there are also, fisheries, resources that many of the littoral states are very interested in gaining their hands on. But I think the fundamental stake and interest for the claimant states is that the South China Sea dispute involves the issue of sovereignty, involves the issue of territorial integrity. And this is particularly stark and significant for a country like Malaysia. If you look at the geography of Malaysia, there's Peninsular Malaysia, and then there is East Malaysia, what I think many people know as Borneo. And if you look at what cleaves this nation, it is the South China Sea. It takes 3 hours to get from Kuala Lumpur, the capital, to Sabah on the eastern side of Malaysia in Borneo. 3 hours to get, I mean, it's not a big deal for Americans, I guess, because it takes a lot longer for you to get from one coast to another. But for a small country like Malaysia, to get from one city to another over a whole body of sea in 3 hours, that's quite a bit of travel time for us. And so it's absolutely critical. In fact, you know, this territorial integrity and the contiguity of the Malaysian borders is specifically mentioned in the National Defence Policy of Malaysia. So maintaining it and maintaining that sovereignty and the access to our own states is extremely important for a claimant like Malaysia.
Great. Well, Admiral Koda, if you could talk a little bit about why Japan has gotten more involved in the South China Sea. And Southeast Asia more generally. We've seen Prime Minister Abe, very early in his tenure, visit every Southeast Asian country. And then, of course, the Japanese Self-Defense Force has been more actively involved in the South China Sea. And what's the linkage between the East China Sea, where Japan administers the Senkaku or Diaoyu Islands, and the South China Sea? What are Japan's interests here?
Okay, the South China Sea, like the United States, geographically, Japan is out of the South China Sea, or non-coastal nation. And also the various territorial disputes, Japan is the third party, so nothing to do with those. So Japanese position on those two issues, or the geography and the territorial dispute, Japan is not the party involved. But at the same time, I think there are 3 or 4 elements. One is the sea is common to everybody. So from the Phoenician days or Greek days to today, 4,000 years, the human beings has been appreciating and using the sea as the linkage of various nations economically, politically, and sometimes militarily. So South China Sea is not an exception. Where the human beings' activities exist, that belongs to everybody. That's the principle. And second, Japanese economy. One of the largest users of the South China Sea in terms of the maritime, the commodity trafficking and the natural resource traffic, not trafficking, the traffic, sorry. I'm not a native speaker, so if I'm trafficking, I'm a very bad guy. And the thirdly, the value of the U.S.-Japan alliance. Of course, the U.S.-Japan alliance primarily for the defense of Japan in terms of the aggressions. But at the same time, the role of the U.S.-Japan alliance or U.S. presence in the region is really a stabilizing the element of the regional security. So for our Japanese position, keeping the United States in this region, and what in this region, from the Indian Ocean to the Pacific, so South China Sea just sits in the middle of the kind of the U.S. area of responsibility for the security in this region. And the last thing is, Japan is the seafaring nation, so we appreciate the common value of the free use of the sea. And this is pretty close to the first thing, but it's not a history or fundamental value. For Japan, the free use of the sea is a kind of the fundamental national value. So if anything that impedes the free use of the sea, including the South China Sea, Japan will do something within the Japanese constitutional limitations or within the umbrella of the US-Japan alliance. But based on our mission sharing, Japan will do anything to maintain the free use of the sea. So I think that is the Japanese the connection with the South China Sea. And East China Sea, yes, there is the territorial issues. But for Japan, thanks to the very strong Japanese Coast Guard, perhaps it's fair to say it's the third largest, US, China, then Japan. So our Coast Guard, of course, the Japanese, the territorial waters and economic EZ is very large. So I don't think that's good enough, but Japan Coast Guard is very strong, the organization to protect the safety of the Japanese waters. And backed up by the Japanese Maritime Self-Defense Force, many Americans that do not know the size, but size of the destroyer and the maritime patrol aircraft and submarine is larger than the US Pacific Fleet. So that's one thing China cannot ignore. So yes, Chinese Coast Guard ship is coming around the Senkaku waters, but we 24/7, 365 days, the bases, we keep our ships there. And there is an eye-on-eye contact against Chinese ships. So just roughly speaking, 3 days per month. That's the rough rate of the Chinese invasion into the Japanese territorial waters. But basically, they can't stay longer. So from Beijing's strategic thinkers' point of view, the first thing they need to take into account, and they are taking into account, is the Japanese capability. And more important thing is if anything more happens, there is a US-Japan alliance. So for China, this is my view, my assessment, but for China or Beijing, it's very difficult to escalate the Senkaku situations. That's why last 5 or 6 years, my terminology, the high tension, altitude, level flight with some peaks. I hope you understand what I mean. So, but no more than that. So if somebody says the East China Sea situation in East China Sea is stable, yes. In terms of the high altitude, high tension altitude, level flight, yes. But still, one thing we can't ignore is tension is still high and there is a risk. So, but at least my observation, both Tokyo and Beijing is wise enough to assess the real situation. So that is another reason why no escalation for last 6 years or so. And I think will be so in the next foreseeable future. That means 10 years or more. The situation remains fairly constant. That's my observation. Thank you.
The risk of these maritime disputes escalating, I think, into conflict is a shared concern. So if we look at this from the perspective of US interests, Brian, which conflict is more dangerous for the United States? Which is more likely to lead to perhaps an accident that could escalate to a wider conflict, or a deliberate use of force that could draw in the United States?
I think that is an excellent question. You've heard. First, I would like to just refer to my excellent colleagues' comments. And first, I completely agree. I think China is dramatically increasing its positive engagement with the region. I think there's a lot of promise behind AIIB and One Belt, One Road. And in many ways, it's consistent with a role Japan has often played in the region in terms of supporting connectivity and infrastructure development. On the ASEAN piece, I think it's crucial on the South China Sea management. And I will get back to the two different regions. But ASEAN and China have played a critical role managing tensions in the South China Sea in the past. If you look at like the 1990s, it was a particularly dangerous time in the region. You had Mischief Reef, the rapid kind of grabbing and building on a lot of these islands, at times kind of shots fired, use of kinetic force. And ASEAN and China, in their wisdom, in 2002 agreed to a declaration on the conduct of parties in the South China Sea, which I think some critics point to as well, it's non-binding and it's only kind of this paper agreement. But if you look at how it actually played out, it substantially reduced tensions in the region. I think you saw a commitment to tenets of international law, particularly freedom of navigation and overflight. But you also saw an agreement that held for probably 5-7 years on kind of self-restraint, and the parties would not take actions to escalate tensions against each other. So I think there's, it'll be very interesting to see how ASEAN responds to the ruling. I know it's a complex ruling, so it's going to take some time. My understanding is there are discussions now on how to interpret it and what to say about it. But my hope is that following the ruling, it could help to provide added kind of impetus to ASEAN-China Code of Conduct discussions, which have been happening in fits and starts for the past decade plus. But really, I think hold the promise to managing some of these tensions and setting real rules of the road. To your question on which is more dangerous, East China Sea, South China Sea, I think being honest, it's very difficult to make kind of a hard and fast delineation there. If you talk to most kind of strategic observers of the region, I think there is a sense that South China Sea you could see conflict more easily, that there are more actors involved. You're seeing probably a more overt militarization with the island buildup, and you're seeing kind of greater patrols of vessels in the region. But the dynamic at play over the Senkakus is significant and worrying. I mean, we've had protracted kind of standoffs. At times, you claimed kind of incursions and attempts to kind of disrupt the status quo. So it's difficult for me to say is one more risky than the other. I think obviously we'd prefer seeing neither kind of lead to conflict.
Absolutely.
I would say I think there's the potential. Japan and China have at times had a contentious kind of relationship, particularly at the leader level. There's been some cooling. I think tensions are still great over the Senkakus. I think it would be good to have kind of greater dialogue over them. In particular, I would kind of credit Japan. I think if you've seen how they have been trying to kind of protect their governance over the Senkakus, it's a use of Coast Guard vessels as opposed to Navy vessels. And when you go and you meet with Japanese officials, they're very quick to point to that. And a lot of these Coast Guard vessels are not armed in a major way. So there is an inherent kind of desire to take a de-escalatory approach, which I think is helpful. And in response to the Admiral's comment, I also, Japan has clearly been stepping up its engagement in the South China Sea as well, and I think that makes sense. I mean, I think Japan, China, ASEAN, the United States all have interests in this crucial region. I think that the challenge is channeling this interest into positive outcomes, like greater cooperation on humanitarian assistance and disaster relief, or kind of steps that actually will build some habits of cooperation and working together, and when you see common goods. And to some extent, you've seen this. You look at the Indian Ocean, which is a totally different area, but there's been some cooperation where India is really building up HADR capacity of kind of its neighbors. And I wonder if there could be a similar approach in the South China Sea in terms of quieting the environment down and showing this is how, as countries are looking more at the region, doing more in the region, you channel it in kind of cooperative ways.
Elena, I'd like to ask you about how China and the U.S. approaches to the South China Sea looks from ASEAN. So China says, we want win-win cooperation with everyone. We just want to have good relations with our neighbors. We don't have a zero-sum approach to the region. And the United States says, we're very happy if all the countries in ASEAN have a good relationship with China and with the United States. From the perspective of ASEAN, does that make sense? Is this credible? Does ASEAN feel like it's in the middle between the United States and China and has to choose?
I think the rhetoric is ideal, that everybody wants to be friends with each other. And that is something that ASEAN itself wants, right? But then the question is there an ASEAN position on striking a balance between the US and China? And at the superficial level, there is. But because ASEAN is comprised of 10 very different member states with very different interests and also different levels of development, you're obviously going to get a split in how each of these countries feels about its relationship with the United States and its relationship with China. It's a tricky balance to maintain, and I think that's why you see the variances in approaches to the South China Sea dispute, even among the 4 claimant states. So I won't venture to speak on behalf of the other 3, nor am I speaking for the Malaysian government, but I think what you've seen by the Malaysian government in particular is this walking of a very fine line between its relations with the US on the one hand, China on the other, as well as other major and middle powers in the region. It has, for example, comprehensive partnerships with both countries. It's part of the TPP, it's also part of RCEP. And at the sub-regional level, this is played out to be a US versus China thing, these regional trade arrangements, and they're not. They're essentially, RCEP is an ASEAN creation, and ASEAN itself, I think, has forgotten that, unfortunately. So it's sometimes an extremely delicate balance to keep, and Malaysia, as I've pointed out before, has been accused of being spineless and flaky because it's trying to maintain good relations with both major powers in the region. But I think there's a very pragmatic approach that all countries in the region are trying to take, and that is we want to have good, beneficial economic ties with both major powers. China is increasingly, if not already, a top major economic partner for all the countries in the region. But in Malaysia at least, the US is among the top 3, still among the top 3 foreign direct investors in the country. So it's not an easy balance to keep, and I think that's why you'll see as we head down the South China Sea dispute after the tribunal ruling, there's going to be a fine-tuning of approaches in each of the countries that are involved.
The arbitral tribunal's ruling yesterday lays the groundwork for a potential way forward. Some people think that this will increase tensions in the region, and others think that there might open up a door for diplomacy. We saw yesterday a very important statement that was issued, a government statement by the Foreign Ministry, which is quite authoritative. And then apparently today, the Chinese State Council issued a new white paper on the South China Sea. So I'm wondering, Julia, if you can tell us your perspective. Do you think that China now, it seems to me at least, is beginning to clarify its position more on the South China Sea? This has actually been an objective of US policy, to compel China to be less ambiguous about its position. So with the statement yesterday that has made, I think, the most comprehensive description of China's claim in combination with this white paper. So do you think that this ruling is going to lead to greater tension, or either in the near term or in the longer term, does it lay the groundwork for a potential way forward to resolve these disputes in the South China Sea peacefully and diplomatically?
Yeah, very good question, but very comprehensive one, to answer it thoroughly. But I think for an easy answer, I think temporarily it kind of really increased the tension. But I think from long term, probably really push China and the regional states, and including the states and probably Japan also, all get interest in the South China Sea, to think further. And what are the available ways or feasible ways to resolve the dispute? I think that's probably a shorter one. And with specific regard to the ruling came up yesterday, I think I look at both the governmental announcement, the statement, and also the white paper, but not great detail. But I think generally I can see it's kind of reiteration of China's position. And I think from the start of that arbitration, China had made it very clear and constant about its sovereignty claim in the South China Sea. And with this ruling, I think probably the part really upset China is about the prejudice to China's sovereignty claim. And then with the ambiguity part, China had been criticized, I think mainly related to the water. And this probably ruling more relate to that, but certainly affect the Chinese sovereignty claim. I think that's the part probably for China to really work through those things and then probably develop something like more comprehensive. And maybe general, I just think about the East Asian region. I'm doing a lot of the CIDO teaching and research on this issue. It's kind of fortunate, very unfortunate, because we sit too close to each other, really getting crowded when they love to see the maritime zone introduced. But I think also probably, and also another thing is fortunate for the region, you really have to work together. You can't really, kick each other out. Like as Alina mentioned, we have to share the ocean. And then probably with this ruling, we will see more clear. You can't really get it, like with this way and that. It's something like maybe we try with arbitration. And then we still think we have to sit down to discuss about it among ourselves. And then probably eventually we reach something, for everyone to agree or at least acceptable. So I think probably from this perspective, we see the various sides of this ruling. At least we try this, and then we know probably still we have to come back to negotiate and use our own terms or our own ways. I'm embedded in Asian culture, things like that. I think probably temporarily, I think I tend to think that we're more positive maybe.
Great. Anyone else have a view on that issue? Okay, well, Brian, let me ask you, in the East China Sea, President Obama reiterated the U.S. position that the Senkaku Diaoyu Islands fall within the scope of the U.S.-Japan Mutual Defense Treaty when he visited in 2014. And I think many people believe that that has had a stabilizing impact because it signaled to China that if there were to be a conflict over those islands, that the United States might well be involved. So if we talk about, again, the risk of conflict, and we look at the South China Sea, where the United States has a defense treaty with the Philippines, but has not made a similar clarification as to whether or not it covers some of the islands that Philippines occupy or under what circumstances it might be invoked. And there are some people, I think, who believe that the failure of the U.S. to do that has, in fact, conflict or tension that could increase, that could result in the South China Sea around, for example, Scarborough Shoal or Second Thomas Shoal, where the Philippines has a contingent of Marines sitting on a rusting out ship called the Sierra Madre. And we've already seen, in fact, China interfere with some of the resupply operations there. And at Scarborough Shoal, there have been some reports of possible dredging by China, building another artificial island. So where some people are calling for greater U.S. steps to deter Chinese action on those two issues, it raises the question of why the United States hasn't been more clear about the treaty.
No, I think that's a very good and difficult question. I think of note, particularly on the Japan front, as we got to President Obama's kind of reaffirmation of the application of the defense treaty, you saw over time a kind of escalation in that reaffirmation, right? So I think there was a build up to President Obama's statement where you had kind of the Assistant Secretary level, Kirk Campbell saying it, and then Secretary Clinton, followed by President Obama, and there was a kind of purposeful increasing the volume on the message. And Bonnie, I think you're exactly right that it did help to cool tensions in the region, and I think rightfully so. That's part of the strategy. If you look at the Philippines and specifically the application of the Mutual Defense Treaty, if you were to talk to U.S. policymakers, I think their argument would be look at the value of kind of the strategic ambiguity associated with the Mutual Defense Treaty. So essentially, by leaving it open to some extent from that question and say U.S. historically has tried to avoid any sort of hypotheticals in this realm. And that I would look instead at kind of the closeness of the U.S.-Philippines relationship that we've seen under the Obama administration, which is really like a renaissance in the bilateral relationship. And I think President Aquino deserves a lot of credit for it as well. But you saw by virtue of kind of the U.S. pivot to the region and greater focus on Southeast Asia in particular, a lot more focus on Philippines holistically. So we have a rich history of democracy and working together, a lot of economic cooperation, particularly the Partnership for Growth. Obviously, you've seen breakthroughs on defense cooperation and maritime security cooperation, particularly with the Enhanced Defense Cooperative Agreement, which was finally approved by the Philippine Supreme Court a short time ago. And I would say very, very good dialogue. I mean, frequent exchanges between Manila and Washington on these issues. Their Foreign Secretary Del Rosario is spectacular. So yeah, I think rather than specifics of the Mutual Defense Treaty, you look at the holistic nature of the discussion. And you raised Scarborough and Second Thomas Shoal, and I think U.S. and Filipino officials are in close contact on these issues, and when appropriate, U.S. is also in contact with Chinese officials to say, our understanding of the issue, and here are steps that we envision on how to de-escalate and find kind of cooperative ways to work through some of these disputes.
Okay, terrific. We're now going to turn to our audience and bring you into the conversation, give you an opportunity to ask our panelists some questions. We have a microphone set up in the back, and so I hope that you'll just raise your hand and I'll call on you, and you can step over to the microphone and please identify yourself and ask a brief question. Okay, this woman right here, yes.
Hi, I'm sorry.
Is that working?
It is.
Yes, just step a little bit closer, please.
I'm Charmaine Deo Gracias, Asia Studies Fellow for East-West Center. My question is for Admiral Koda. For territorial defense, the value of military exercises for the Philippines had been more on strategic signaling and deterrence. What are the prospects of the Philippines and Japan forging a status of visiting forces agreement soon?
Okay.
Okay, Admiral, go ahead.
No,
Just-
no,
yes.
one. Yeah.
Please.
Yeah. The first, of course, the use of military in peacetime. Sometimes they sending a strategic signal to the neighboring nation. So that's common to any country. So it's nothing specific to Japan, Filipino. And also, Japan has been sending ships to Philippines 2 times a year, last 40 years. So this is nothing new. But by accident, media started reporting this one in this year. So it's as if, this looks as if the new, the initiative, but it's not. And the status of force agreement, yeah, that's a pretty sensitive matter. So I think better to have, yes, but a lot of subject to be discussed and solved. So
economic point of view, yes, but from deterring Chinese adventurism in the South China Sea and in the region, no. And you then said that that might mean that the United States and Japan will have to develop a new strategy and new tactics for stability in the region. And I was wondering if you could elaborate at all on what that new strategy or what those new tactics might be. Thank you.
Okay, hold that for a minute. I think I'll collect a couple of questions and then we'll come back to the panel. Yes, got it.
Thank you. Thank you. Excellent panel. Excuse me, Marvin Ott, formerly federal government, currently Johns Hopkins and Wilson Center. A quick comment on the Philippine-U.S. military relationship, mutual security treaty. There was, in fact, a clarifying moment, exchange of letters between Secretary Vance and Minister of Foreign Affairs Romulo in the 1970s, in which the Philippines asked for clarification whether the mutual security treaty covered Philippine claims in the South China Sea, and Secretary Vance said no, it did not. So that presumably was clarified. However, there is an ambiguity built into the treaty which says that if the ships or planes of either party are attacked, presumably on the high seas, then the treaty is invoked. So my question is, given where we are now in the wake of the tribunal's ruling and the concern focused on Scarborough, whether or not members of the panel see or would urge a revisiting of the U.S. position expressed by Secretary Vance with regard to U.S. obligations regarding Philippine territories, claimed territories in the South China Sea.
Okay, thank you. Let's start first with the question to you, Admiral Koda, about U.S.-Japanese strategy and tactics.
You know, since I spent 40 years in the military, so my simple, you know, the scale to value the attempt is successful or not. And that's why I said, you know, but short-term view, the U.S. rebalancing in military is not so successful. So longer term, we need to do something. But, for example, even yesterday's arbitral tribunal ruling, China made its position very clear. They do not agree with that, and the non-binding, and they will keep on, they continue the current the initiative. So I think the situation that U.S. and Japan have to take into account seriously is this is a kind of de facto or fait accompli. So based on this de facto or fait accompli, the situation, what should be the next best approaches for the South China Sea issue, including the Scarborough Shoal? So, and especially from the military point of view, exactly the Senator Sullivan yesterday pointed out, strategic triangle connecting the Woody Islands, Spratlys, and Scarborough, if the Chinese successfully make the island. That is really the strategic triangle staying in the middle of the South China Sea. So that could be the game changer. I'm not saying will be, but could be the game changer. So we have to, US and Japan have to prepare for those type of scenarios, And there are several arenas. For example, the US-Japan guidelines, that provides the new, the means to discuss all the subject that relates to the security of the region. So I'm not provoking, or I'm not saying go for war today, but at least we have to prepare. And one prerequisite, or no, one condition is China will keep on doing the current artificial island making and keep on claiming the 9-dash line, whatever the ruling already was. So that is the factor. So, that is what US-Japan should do for the future. And if we are prepared, we are going to provide some flexibility, political flexibility to the government, not going for war immediately. If not, the option will be narrowed. So there will be the larger chance for going for the military clash. That's the last thing for us to do. Thank you.
I'd like to give Julia an opportunity to talk about maybe what China's concerns are about US-Japan cooperation, whether or not you think there might be any more island building, particularly on Scarborough Shoal. I know that Wang Yi, foreign minister, last year had said that China was finished with its artificial island building, but I know there continues to be some concern. So can you talk about those issues a little bit?
Yes, certainly. Thank you. Actually, I think I would like to probably just expand a little bit about China's general position about this ruling, I think. As I mentioned, we can see from yesterday and today and the statement from the government foreign affairs, and clearly reiterated China's position. And that, I mean, for the sovereignty issue, for the maritime boundary issue, and then as the Admiral mentioned about the island building things, I think that have been done in the past year and a half, things like that. And also, I think, quite delighted to see China still maintain its constant position about open the door to the negotiations. And I think probably with that part, I think we really, I don't really see probably a kind of really extreme situation. I was a bit concerned about China, started immediately, announce something and adopt some action. But I mean, based on that, I think if you look at I mentioned the seascape change, and China basically is a country really worked hard to try to maintain a peaceful and we use harmonious environment in the ocean. And the sea, how we get there, we ask the question, how did we get here? I think it's kind of action and reaction in the past few years. And China, like was said, a lot of critics about China saying assertive or even aggressive, but that's within that kind of circle of the circulation of escalation about the situation. And with that context, I think certainly China worries quite a lot, I think, about the China-US relation and the rebalancing policy in general, and particularly in the South China Sea, and I mentioned earlier, and the lining up of the regional states. Before that, I think we do have that maritime dispute because I mentioned the narrow kind of geography feature and the long history and things like that. But generally, the East China Sea or South China, they maintain pretty well, I mean, peacefully, until only recent years with this closing up probably the strategic relation between US, Japan, also the rebalancing or pivoting to the East Asia. I think those are the things. And then we also heard about, like the Admiral mentioned, maybe the rebalancing was not as successful in stopping China doing certain things. And I think that could be a dangerous kind of mindset if you keep on, going that way. I don't know, because this ruling is very new. I don't know what will be the next for China to do something, to counterback or things like that. And if we meet something like that and in a further way along the line, probably I don't know, the situation would be. But I think the situation at the moment for China is quite clear: maintain its position and then still work for a peaceful solution for the region. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Brian, can you comment on the Philippines question?
Right. I think it's an excellent question, and I think referring back to the Vance letter, I think there's also a Secretary of Defense Cohen kind of corollary or statement kind of followed. As you note, the ambiguity stems specifically in the Constitution itself. I think, the way I've been thinking about it just in the last 24 hours, I think this ruling provides a moment to reevaluate kind of many pieces of kind of policy approaches in the region, right? So I think, in terms of the Philippines, obviously anything around the Mutual Defense Treaty is going to be, a collaborative approach. You have a new government in Manila. I think U.S. and Filipino discussions are off to the right foot now. It's a foreign secretary, with a lot of experience in the United States, defense secretary, new defense secretary who has experience working in the United States, cooperating with the U.S. But it's going to take time to digest the statement and determine what are the real world implications, particularly after we see how these sort of parties in the region kind of respond. So I might say it's a little premature to think about reinterpreting or reimagining aspects of the defense treaty. Because we have to see how the future plays out. That being said, I think there are a number of steps that we can be doing in the near term. And one is, I think you've been seeing, talk about the importance of the ruling. Obviously, there's going to be a lot that has to be interpreted, but underscoring the importance of an international order based on rule of law, and that these rulings have meaning, particularly because there's no kind of viable coercive enforcement mechanism. So it's really up to the countries involved to determine what the implications mean. So I think you're talking about it, it's enhancing dialogue among the parties. I think it is thinking more about how do you use this as a moment to re-energize code of conduct discussions, or do you widen the aperture? This is an idea that was batted around for a while, but do you find ways to use like the East Asia Summit mechanism as another avenue to discuss the issue? Obviously it brings in a number of more parties who have interest but are not directly involved. But should we think about ways to use this as a jump start on kind of the diplomatic track? I think in time, as we encourage kind of no provocative responses and kind of a calm approach, it'll be time to evaluate how does this have real world implications in terms of freedom of navigation exercises, how the countries and the navies and the coast guards kind of operate in the region. And maybe there is a new paradigm for thinking about confidence building mechanisms. So basically, this is now the international legal understanding of, the amount of rights projected by some of these land features. And now here is how we agree to mechanisms of how we operate around each other in the South China Sea. So I think it's an important moment. It might be a little bit too soon to figure out exactly what the implications are because we're waiting to see how everyone responds. But I think in the next few weeks and months, I imagine folks here in DC and in capitals in the region are thinking pretty creatively about how do you make sure that this has meaning and ultimately leads to the enhancement of peace and maintenance of stability in the region and maybe greater sources of cooperation.
Before I turn to the audience for another question, Alina, I'd like to ask you about the Code of Conduct. There have been suggestions that the members of ASEAN should conclude their own draft of the Code of Conduct and then essentially present that to China. Of course, the Treaty of Amity and Cooperation was eventually negotiated, signed among the members of ASEAN. So is this feasible? If it isn't, why not?
I think you heard those discussions even earlier on, right? There were disagreements about whether there would be a clean slate that we would start from or whether there would be an initial version tabled. And so there are all kinds of discussions that have been floating around the COC, which has contributed to its delay, even from the very start. And I think because of this delay, there is increasingly growing frustration among some of the ASEAN claimants. Because there is, perceived or real, there seems to be a foot dragging by China on the conclusion of the Code of Conduct. There's a rhetoric that there needs to be early conclusion of it, but some countries can afford to wait longer than others. And I guess those countries will extend that time frame to suit its national interests. But I think I'd like to, take off from what Brian said, and I think this ruling should be an opportunity for ASEAN to re-energize the Code of Conduct. I sense that there will be some resistance to it, but I'm hoping that the ASEAN Foreign Ministers meeting, which will be convened next week, can put some impetus into those negotiations again. I don't know if the ASEAN ministers would be open to bringing that to the East Asia Summit because of possible resistance from China, among other countries. But I'm hoping that really this will be an opportunity because ASEAN's credibility, centrality, unity, all those nice words that ASEAN likes to throw about are really at stake here.
Great, thank you very much. So let's go back to the audience for another question. Yes, right here. Please go to the microphone.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, just stand a little bit
I'm
closer.
Angela Marsan from Manila Mail newspaper. I was just wondering because a ninth grader asked me, what's the problem among this? Is it working? I was just wondering, I'm concerned about China reacting to the ruling that they will still maintain their claim about that 9-dash line. And so that means that they will be creating more artificial islands. And from the studies of, maritime studies, they said the artificial islands have been affecting the coral reefs and eventually the ecosystem, and it will lessen the food supply of the people. So how do you explain to a ninth grader the logic of building artificial islands before and in the future? That's my question.
Okay, we'll have one last question, then we'll come back to the panel. Lauren Hersheen, back, please.
Thank you all very much. I'm Lauren Hershey. I've been a student of the region for about 50 years. I'm just getting back up to speed here. I have three quick questions for you. And I am a semi-retired attorney, and I've studied law of the sea. First question, should the U.S. Move rather emphatically and deliberatively to ratify UNCLOS? And Mr. Andrews, I'd invite your particular response and the moderators as well. Secondly, exclusive economic zones What are the economics? Are there hydrocarbons there? What has to be exploited? If you look out over 10 years, are we going to have joint development agreements? Again, Mr. Andrews and the moderator and all three of you other panelists. Third question, can you come back in a year and rebrief us?
Okay. We're going to start with you, Julia, about how you explain to a ninth grader about why China's building artificial islands in the South China Sea.
I don't really think I need to explain that. You see a lot of announcement from the Minister of Foreign Affairs. I mean, explain why China did that. And you ask about if China is going to do more. I don't know, honestly. But I think this thing started from when the arbitration started. After that, I mean, post that period. And then I think I can certainly see a concern from the other countries about China. Actually, China mentioned that for the civil uses and services provide public goods. I think that's right, but also kind of side effect maybe for other states perspective. It's consolidating. It's what the features it controls. I think that's for sure. And also, I mean, from international scholars and from at home too, concerns about the impact on the marine environment and also the marine resources, the marine living resources, actually. And a lot of proposals submitted to the relevant agencies and to how to protect or to better protect or to avoid, I mean, to minimize the damages to the damages to the marine environment or marine living resources, particularly corals there. And I think experts have been made, but certainly from yesterday's CSIS conference, we see still a lot of concerns and also some scientific research project conducting there. So I think that probably will be valuable input in case, I mean, there is anything similar happening there, probably for China really to take care of that issue, I think. Yeah.
Okay. And earlier, of course, Admiral Koda talked about the security and military importance of these artificial islands for China, so we should not ignore that.
Can I jump in on this
please.
ninth grader issue? So I guess the question I would throw back is, what nationality would your ninth grader be? Because I think we've seen videos that have come out on Chinese social media, primarily by the government, and these cute little videos, So if you're talking about kids who are younger, there are these videos, animated videos, that explain what China is doing in the South China Sea. And if I were a ninth grader or a sixth grader, I would completely swallow the message. I think one of the videos, a few of the videos that I watched actually explained the Chinese rationale for building in the South China Sea as protecting the safety and security of the waterways, providing stability for its neighbors. And so I think it depends. If you are a Vietnamese or a Filipino ninth grader, it might be explained to you in a different way. But I think it also begs the question of how do you explain the South China Sea dispute more largely and more generally to the layperson without inflaming tensions, without inciting nationalistic tendencies. And I think that's a much more difficult question, but I'd agree with Julia. I think the common point that might be a good starting reference would be protecting marine ecology and the marine environment.
Okay, let's turn to the question of the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. Brian, why hasn't the United States ratified UNCLOS? Should we?
It's a great question. I think it is a little ironic that the U.S. has not ratified it yet. So this is the kind of foundational document in the modern era of how to approach kind of the maritime commons around the world. And it's one that the United States was deeply involved in negotiating, and that fundamentally is consistent with kind of U.S. interests around the world and kind of our commercial interests, our military interests. So the short answer is yes. I do think it would behoove the U.S. Senate to ratify the agreement. I don't want to get into why individual senators might not be. I think it's important to note that the U.S. treats UNCLOS as international law, that the U.S. Navy, when it operates overseas, operates under its tenets. But I do think, given the importance that we place on the maintenance of kind of a rules-based order, we would stand on kind of better footing if we followed through with full ratification, just being honest. That being said, I think there is a weight behind the fact that we do observe it in practice and follow its tenets. In terms, I think there's a great question on kind of the EEZs and what are we talking about, and it might be too complex for me, but in kind of a quick thumbprint, I think there are multiple elements stemming these disputes, right? So like strategic elements, economic elements, senses of nationalism and kind of national identity. Specifically on the economic side, you're exactly right on the hydrocarbons. I think there's been some surveys done. I think there are questions about how substantial the deposits may be. The U.S. policy has long been supportive of joint development as a means of kind of releasing some of these tensions, provided it is being done on kind of equitable terms and that there aren't elements of kind of economic coercion or other coercion involved in kind of reaching these agreements. But it's not, it wouldn't be fair to say it's purely the potential oil and gas deposits. I actually think one of the drivers is also just the fishing rights. And you often see that as being kind of one of the triggers for these disputes, whether you're talking about Vietnamese fishermen off kind of the paracels, a unilateral fishing ban that's declared every year, or the fact that this impacts livelihoods in the region. And so it's not just kind of broader macro national economic interests, but you have these communities in the Philippines and China and Vietnam, Malaysia, that are dependent on kind of access to these waters. And so it carries a particular weight at a personal level. So I think that's kind of the element of the economics that drives some of the complexity of these issues. In terms of coming back, in a year, I would love to. I think we'll have a better idea what the near-term implications would be of the ruling yesterday.
Well, on the question of UNCLOS, I am a strong supporter of ratifying UNCLOS. I have an article in the Cipher Brief today explaining why the United States should ratify UNCLOS, and I think that the attitudes in the region suggest that the United States is undercutting its own position, even though we abide by it, but we have not ratified it. We give China another reason to criticize the United States for being hypocritical. But beyond that, we have interests in protecting companies that want to invest and engage in seabed mining, to consolidate and protect our own claims for an extended continental shelf under UNCLOS. There are legitimate reasons to have reservations, and many of these are raised by senators, including Senator Dan Sullivan, who spoke at CSIS yesterday. But I believe that the time has come to ratify this treaty because the potential costs of staying outside have really grown. And in my own participation, for example, in the Shangri-La Dialogue over the last few years in Singapore, I have found this has become a central issue. And my own view is that China, although it has ratified it, it does not really observe it. The United States observes it, but we have not ratified it. And so I think we need to fix this. I hope China will become more observant of the treaty, and the United States will ratify it going forward. I will have to give you an opportunity to say something, Julia, and then we'll have to wrap up.
You said the most part is absolutely right. Only the part related to China. I have to challenge that. I think we need to differentiate the Chinese general position regard to UNCLOS. And with maritime disputes. In general, China really followed very closely. China participated the whole process of negotiation, the negotiation process of UNCLOS. And really, not all the things China was happy about, but China ratified in 1996. And with marine environmental protection, fisheries, and other things, maritime things, follow the general rules and things like that. But with maritime issue, the dispute in the layout along its coast, it's really something for the sovereignty and for maritime boundary delimitation. And those are the things that China has its own views. So I wouldn't think it's not observed the UNCLOS. That's too big. Just I have to challenge. Sorry about that.
Well, One of the problems, of course, is continuing disagreements about how UNCLOS is interpreted and applied. And this will be a problem going forward, I think, for all of the nations that have interests in these maritime areas. There are many articles in UNCLOS where there are disagreements. But this recent ruling has begun to clarify some of them. And so I think we've had an interesting discussion today to talk about some of the implications of the tribunal ruling on the South China Sea. We have talked about other issues like the prospects for tensions or conflict, hopefully tensions being diffused and avoiding conflict. We've talked about prospects for a code of conduct and about the interests at stake in the maritime areas in the East China Sea and South China Sea and in the Indian Ocean. So I would really like to thank our guests today, Brian Andrews, Admiral Koda, Elena Noor, and Julia Xue. Thank you so much for coming.